Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Building Trust, a Practical Approach to Conflict Resolution. My name is Claire. I'm the Deputy Registrar at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in from. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. So just before we begin today's webinar, I would like to share a few important announcements to have an effective and professional webinar experience. Please know that the session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. To maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled your video feeds. We do, however, encourage your engagement through the Q&A window, so do feel free to submit your questions at any point during the webinar. You'll see the button at the bottom of your screen. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in. They will be addressed at the end of the presentation. And just note that our chat function has been deactivated as well. For those of you who are seeking your Con Ed learning hours, do note that your attendance is crucial. You will have to attend at least 80% of today's webinar to be accredited those hours to your transcript, and just give us a week or so to process and report those hours. The speaker today does not provide any kind of insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for any errors or omissions in the discussions. Also, we provide automated closed captioning services available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our audience. And without further ado, please welcome today's speaker, Will Goldbloom. Over to you, Will.
All right, thank you so much for having me again. And thanks to those of you who are interested in listening to me for a second time. For those of you who have not met me before, I did a presentation earlier on the different obligations that organizations have under the Occupational Health and Safety Act as it relates to workplace harassment. And this presentation is a little different. This is less legally focused, even though, my background is I've trained as a lawyer. I would say that based on the experience I've had and the work that I do, the thing that I most often deal with is interpersonal conflict in workplaces. That is at the core of every complaint that I deal with. And over time, I've noticed that even though my job as a workplace investigator is often to ensure workplaces are following their legal obligations as they relate to preventing workplace harassment, and when there is a complaint or an incident of workplace harassment, having it investigated. The thing that organizations seem to fail to do, and the thing that I'm trying to help them more with, is dealing with the conflict at the root of it all. And I've been lucky enough over the time that I've been practicing to be able to offer different kinds of services, but also to learn more about the work that I'm doing. So as you'll see when we go through this presentation, I'm going to show you some data that I uncovered from the last 100 workplace investigations that I did to try to understand what are the concerns that people are bringing forward. How often are those concerns substantiated, and how often do they reflect a kind of conflict dynamic that doesn't get addressed by any kind of legal prohibition, but is just kind of part of the workplace culture? So I think a lot of you who are listening have a fair amount of work experience. And I think in the world of architecture, there is a lot of conflict that occurs, conflicts between, short-term interests for a project and long-term interests for a project, cost versus design. And you might work in groups of people where you have different perspectives on what is appropriate and what isn't. You might have different working styles or ways of interacting with people that might differ. And it can be really difficult to manage different personalities and different ways of being in a work environment. So I think what we're going to talk about today is just recognizing the degree to which that is a fundamental component of any workplace. There will always be conflict. There is no avoiding it. Yet, our tendency is to be extremely avoidant when it comes to workplace conflict. We would rather do anything than address conflict head on. And unfortunately, the legal tools that we have to address workplace conflict also are very conflict avoidant in a way, in the sense that they offer, workplace investigations, complaint systems, they offer ways to deal with conflict in a very impersonal approach. And the end result is a determination as to whether, there was or was not a legal wrongdoing, but there is no effort made to address the conflict at the heart of the problem. And that's why organizations need to do a lot more to gain a kind of facility with dealing with conflict because it is part of the work environment. And when organizations outsource to people like me to investigate complaints, it just doesn't address this problem. And conflict, as I said, doesn't have to be a problem because it's a fundamental component of a work environment. It's really a question of how, what some practitioners in this world say, how conflict resilient people in your work environment are. And it's hard to make people conflict resilient because people come to a work environment with lots of different experiences, with conflict from their family of origin, from other workplaces, and it's quite an uphill battle to get people on the same page when it comes to dealing with conflict. That's why it has to be this ongoing practice that happens in every workplace. And I can tell you from my experience, no one seems to be doing it that well, except I've had the privilege of working with certain municipalities. And within a municipality, if you have, let's say, a group of firefighters who are living and working together all the time, you can't really afford to be conflict avoidant because you have to work together, you have to live together, and you're entering really dangerous situations where you have to trust each other. So, in those kinds of groups, they're really good at discussing conflict openly and really trying to address it. I would say it's more often the more corporate environments where people are much more avoidant and where conflict is rife and conflict is something that actually serves to break down a group of people or a culture as opposed to keeping them together. So these are just some observations I've had, and I think again, I'm really pleased that those of you who are here are attending, and I hope that by the end of this, you're going to feel like, okay, I need to rethink how I'm going to approach conflict in my work environment. And unfortunately, even though, again, it's something we want to avoid, it's going to take a lot of slow and steady work if it's something you want to change. So I've kept my slide from my last presentation for those of you who remember the Radiant City in Marseille. But I want to go through what we're going to cover today. So we're going to start by identifying common sources of workplace conflict and potential outcomes. What are the challenges that arise? We're going to look at different approaches to dealing with conflict resolution. Um, and as we go further along, I'm going to ask you some questions for you to just think about in terms of what personal values you have and how those can contribute to more effective conflict management. And then we're going to see, okay, how can we create actionable steps or things we can do to ensure that we resolve conflict in a way that aligns with our values in our work environment and our personal values as well. And then finally, how do we implement conflict baselines, which is a principle I'm going to talk about that I've kind of thought of as I've been training and helping organizations dealing with conflict. All right. I have to start with some kind of architecture reference, right? So this is a picture of Old City Hall in Toronto, which is now kind of potentially going to be where the Ontario legislature is going to be housed because they're doing all these renovations at Queen's Park. Used to be, when I was an articling student, it was also a courthouse, right? So all the bunch of criminal courts were there as well. It was a place I was in every day. It's a beautiful Romanesque revival uh, building that was built in 1899 by Edmund James Lennox. And why does this relate to conflict? Well, for those of you who are, well versed in Ontario architecture and the architecture of the city, you might recall that the architect included these kind of grotesque images of members of city council. He was really upset because members of city council were angry with the cost overruns and the delays with building this structure. And as a result, the architect's name was not going to be on a plaque next to Old City Hall to commemorate the building. And so not only did he put these faces on the building itself, but he also had his name carved in certain parts of the building because his name wasn't included on the plaque. And I love this as a kind of historical understanding of workplace or was conflict because clearly this architect was upset with these city councilors and to kind of like immortalize his anger with them, he put their faces on this building that will last like forever. And I think, imagine being in a work environment now and being angry with someone and doing something like this. This is like such, if you think about it, such an egregious act to make a caricature of someone and put them in a building and have it, be there and never be removed. I think today things would not go that way. I think things would, arguably someone would petition to have the faces removed. They'd have to hire someone, remove, and adjust the actual architecture of the building. But back then, perhaps they were less concerned with workplace conflict than we are now. Um, I think I wanted to talk a little bit about conflict as we deal with it in our contemporary culture. So this is a still from a documentary that my partner made called Someone Lives Here. And for those of you who might remember, this is another kind of architecture story where there was a carpenter named Khalil Seavright who was building tiny shelters for people who were living outside during the pandemic. You might have seen them. They kind of had a slanted roof and they were on wheels. And basically, it was a way to address all of the encampments that were in lots of the city parks at the time. They were safer places for people to live outside, shielded them from the elements. The buildings themselves would warm by using people's body heat. And there was a huge clash between Khalil and the city of Toronto. The city of Toronto advocated to remove all of, or not advocated, they made an injunction to prohibit him from making any more of these structures. And slowly they removed all of them from the city. And now you can see the city has done a number of things to change how people live outside. There's much more scrutiny, there's more policing, there's different approaches they're trying to take to have community police people be on site at different parks where encampments have formed, even though they continue to be forming to this day. But I think that I was going to put another slide here, another picture actually. I think that what I've noticed is a lot of the conflicts that are occurring in our city or across the globe are somehow being incorporated into the work environment. So if you for those of you who might have thought about this or have talked about it in work environments, the conflict in what's happening in Gaza right now. I've seen as a workplace investigator conflicts about what's happening in Gaza and how people here are responding to it have now led to complaints and interpersonal conflict in different work environments. And I think that this shows how people who feel strongly about a certain cause, even if it's not strictly work related, first of all, they wear it on their sleeve and it's something that they talk about in their work environment, and it's something they expect their employer to be dealing with, to be addressing. And if there is disagreement about something related to, let's say, encampments in parks, if there is disagreement or different perspectives on what's happening in Gaza, then people become really upset and they attribute certain qualities to the person who is disagreeing with them. And they don't necessarily have the ability to have a conversation and to work through those different perspectives. The relationship then breaks down because they're so conflict avoidant, they just don't talk to each other, and it has ramifications in the workplace more generally. So, because we are so focused on things that are happening outside of the workplace, and because those conflicts kind of make their way into the workplace, and because people are so conflict avoidant, it means that workplaces are not just dealing with the conflict that arises in general working conversations, but they're also being expected to manage different perspectives on conflicts outside. And that is just a huge burden, but that is where the culture is right now. And so it's more and more imperative for organizations to have a kind of facility for dealing with workplace conflict, as in an ease with dealing with workplace conflict and interpersonal conflict between people. So hopefully that demonstrates to you just how important this task is, and hopefully that means that you will do something about it. Now I want to talk a little bit about the types of complaints that I've investigated, because I think it's important for you all to understand what types of concerns come forward that come across my desk and see how they get resolved to show you what types of things are bothering people and how often they occur. But first, I want to start with our first poll. You're going to be asked a question. It's just a simple yes, no question. And I'm curious to see what the results are, because this is the very same question that I put on a survey for a municipality that I did some work for. And I want to share the results of that poll and see if they're similar to the results that we get here. Oh, I guess I have to answer it as well. Or maybe not. Okay. Okay. Wow. So maybe this is also a sampling error because of who's coming to this session. So the poll results, yes to this question of, has someone at work ever made you feel bad, uncomfortable, or unsafe? 23 out of 25 respondents said yes, and 2 said no. So this is actually more significant than the municipality that I did this work for. Their answer was about 60% yes, 40% no. Um, so maybe that says something about architecture and different workplaces that deal with that are architecture related. I think that what you should know is that this is just a really common experience. people are very often feeling unsafe or uncomfortable or just bad because of how someone treats them in a work environment. This is a normal workplace hazard. And I think that a lot of the language around workplace harassment is all about prevention. Like you should never feel unsafe or uncomfortable. And like every employer needs to make sure that they are preventing any employee from feeling that way. I really think that's a fool's errand. That's not going to happen. There will always be times when someone does something that makes you feel bad or uncomfortable. Of course, we don't want it to be particularly egregious, but it is something that will happen that can't be fully prevented. So now thinking of that moment of discomfort, for those of you who said yes to that question, this next poll is for you. So for those who said no, you can relax and you can just watch the results flow in. But I want to do the next poll, which asks you kind of what was it? What was the behavior that made you feel uncomfortable or bad? That's the next poll. And there might be an other you wish was there. Try your best to put it in one of these categories. Okay, so this is the results, as you can see, really tend towards things that happen in the lower part. So first of all, it's a lot of comments, um, but it's also this way of dealing with work issues. So work-related conflicts, unwarranted criticism, micromanagement, of course, yelling slurs and insults, that's also kind of inappropriate. But I found when I did this study with the municipality that most of the things that make people feel uncomfortable are things in this bottom half. So micromanagement, unwarranted criticism, um, you know, rumors, people saying things that make you feel uncomfortable that might not sort of target you as an individual, but are kind of unfair. And they're not the types of things that are most often very clearly forms of legally prohibited behavior, such as physical violence, sexual behavior. Of course, comments that reflect stereotypes or biases, there are some comments that would be considered, discriminatory. Others might not be depending on the context. So um, you can see that a lot of the sources of discomfort are things that maybe to an objective observer are upsetting, but are not absolutely harrowing. And it then poses this question as a result of, are these things we can overcome? Are we able to get past a scenario where a colleague, let's say, yells, or where a colleague gives you criticism that you think is unfair? Hopefully, that's something we can do. But again, I think people need some guidance in order to be able to do that. So I want to just show you now some of the uh, types of complaints that I deal with. So when people know that I do workplace investigations, when people hire an external lawyer to investigate complaints, they usually think that it's something pretty serious, and often it is. These are the types of complaints that come forward most often. So and again, it adds up to more than 100% because a lot of complaints have different components in them. Harassment, which is just like behavior that is felt to be unwelcome or inappropriate, that's the vast majority. Sexual harassment has some kind of sexual component, which means either there's a form of sexual touching or there are just comments that target someone based on their sex or their gender identity or gender expression. Discriminatory harassment, that would be more like when people said in the poll that they'd experienced comments that reflect stereotypes or biases. It's words or behavior that target someone based on a prohibited ground of discrimination, such as race, color, place of origin, ethnicity, things like that. And then finally, discrimination. That's usually a complaint where someone feels like they're being treated differently, as in like decisions are made that relate to their work environment and and their background, their race is a factor in that decision. So it's less about kind of interpersonal behavior. Or more often than not, discrimination complaints arise when someone has, let's say, a disability and they feel like their disability isn't appropriately accommodated in the workplace. But as you can see, the vast majority is harassment, just people saying yes to the question that was posed earlier, which is, have you ever experienced something that made you feel uncomfortable, bad, or unsafe at work? If you answered yes, you're really, unless there's a sexual or identity component, you're dealing with just basic harassment. And these are the types of uh, behaviors that people most often complained about. So as you can see, generally it's inappropriate comments or communication. Often it's also just behavior that feels aggressive. Often we most often, see that as yelling, but also it's a lot of how a manager approaches things. Maybe they don't like how they're making decisions, their communication is not transparent, they feel like they're sort of always on them and micromanaging them. Those are the most common things that are happening in workplaces. And so it means that interpersonal conflict is the source of most of these complaints. But I think it's interesting for you to see how often this type of behavior comes up in the type of work I do. I think, again, as I said earlier, people think that I deal with this sort of like really intense, extremely inappropriate behavior. This is more often than not what I'm dealing with. As you can see, sexual behavior or physical contact, that is definitely a small portion of the type of work I do. Often I'm trying to figure out, is what the manager did in this context, reasonable and appropriate, or does it veer into something that's a bit intimidating or targeted? But it's all usually around communication and comments. Now, when you deal with these kinds of issues or these kinds of behaviors, I think another important question for those of you who have felt unsafe or uncomfortable at work, which again is the majority of you, um, what do you do about it? So the last poll asks you that question. If you've experienced something like this, some of those behaviors, what do you do? So let's do the last poll. I realize now that being silent is my way of reminding people if they're doing something else to focus on the poll that's before them, but they might be doing something else. Um, as you answer this poll, I think you should focus on all of the answers and just in your own mind think which of these is an avoidant approach to conflict, or reflects the most avoidant approach to conflict, and which one isn't? Okay, so we've got some like pretty evenly distributed. Um, so still a minority of people would have talked directly to the person who engaged in this behavior. Now, the reason I included this question and these responses is because this was yet another question I posed to this municipality and all of its workers. Now, most of the time, people answered the first two questions. They didn't do anything about it, or they talked to their colleagues. Um, and there was actually another option on here that I didn't include just because of different workplaces, but there was an option of reporting behaviors to HR. So very few people did reported the behavior to HR. A lot of the times people also actually, if they did report it, it would be to a manager. Now, the question after this that I asked was, okay, this is what you did to deal with it. Did things get better, stay the same, or get worse? And for every single approach except for one, the majority of responses by far were things stayed the same or got worse. The only time where that wasn't the majority was when people spoke directly to the person who engaged in the behavior, which, now that I say it out loud and to you, maybe that sounds that realistic and that makes sense. You're going to solve the problem by speaking to the person. But most people do not do that because that means dealing with the conflict head on. And that's not how we operate. I want to go through a couple of other of these slides that reflect the work that I've done. So this is the rate by which complaints of workplace harassment are substantiated. So this is the majority of the work that I do. And as you can see, 70% of the complaints that I deal with are not substantiated. That means I do the investigation, I interview everybody. Sometimes someone is off work during that time or they're separated in the work environment, and 70% of the time, the complaint is not substantiated. It does not meet the definition of workplace harassment. 9% partially substantiated. That means, okay, like some of the behaviors were workplace harassment, but the rest were not. Only 1/5 of complaints of workplace harassment are substantiated. I included this one because for the other types of behaviors, sexual harassment, discriminatory harassment, it's more of those complaints are substantiated. But workplace harassment complaints, which is really interpersonal conflict, most often does not rise to workplace harassment. And you can imagine the time and expense that it takes to go through an investigation for what is really just interpersonal conflict. And think about it also from the perspective of someone who's making this complaint. They genuinely feel aggrieved. I'm not often dealing with people who are making complaints and they're totally vexatious or made in bad faith. People are really upset, but the thing that they're complaining about doesn't meet the definition of workplace harassment. So what are they supposed to do with that conflict? It's really um, very, very serious how they're feeling, and it doesn't get addressed. So as we mentioned before in those poll questions, these are the most common and conflict avoidant methods for resolving conflict. You report up to your manager and you kind of leave it there. You hope that they do it. And often managers, at least from my experience, are not really well trained when it comes to dealing with workplace conflict. Oftentimes they're just naturally good at dealing with conflict, and that's great, but they're usually not hired specifically because they have those competencies. It just so happens that they have them. They're not trained on them. They don't get extra, there's no extra help given by the employer to help them be better at it. They're just relying on whatever skills they came with. Reporting laterally, that's what often happens, and often that turns into gossip, right? People all talk to each other about the one person that they all don't like. And on the one hand, you can see that as a form of mutual support. Oh, I'm dealing with this difficult person. Maybe someone else can help me. But more often than not, it is just complaining and venting, which does help in some way. But there also have been studies that have shown that if an employee is complaining to another employee about a supervisor, and if the employee that they're complaining to just kind of validates everything they're saying, that results in that employee who's complaining having a lower uh, work performance rating on any kind of job rating or job evaluation. There's a correlation there because, as you can imagine, they're kind of annoyed with their supervisor. Their sense of annoyance is getting reinforced by their colleague. And also, as you can imagine, people don't tend to challenge other people's beliefs around them finding someone to be difficult. Our tendency is to validate people's experiences, not to challenge them. Really, if you're reporting laterally or if you're telling someone about someone who's, not doing who's someone you don't like or you're in conflict with, you would want that person to actually challenge your perspective and allow you or compel you to think more critically about the problem that's creating the conflict. But again, that's not something we train people to do. And the easiest way to deal with someone complaining is to just validate what they're saying. The last thing, doing nothing, that's also what a lot of people do. And I would say that there are some benefits to this, but you have to be very good at listening to yourself and how you're feeling and making an objective determination as to whether this conflict is something that you need to resolve to allow you to continue working in that work environment. I mean, oftentimes people do nothing and they are just ruminating and thinking about it more and more and more. And that, of course, will make things worse. But if you can do nothing in the sense that you don't report it or don't talk directly to the person, but you can become at peace with whatever conflict occurred, that can be really helpful. And for a lot of people, that's all they need. They need the time and space to kind of reflect on what's happened and then move forward. But again, we don't often give people the tools to be able to do that. One of the books that I've read to kind of try to understand workplace conflict talks about the neurological effect of it. So our brains aren't able to distinguish between, workplace conflict, things that make people feel sort of uncomfortable and unsafe, like, maybe unwarranted criticism. That is often the psychological response we have is very similar to being in a very unsafe situation where maybe we feel like our life is at stake. And so you've often heard about, trauma responses to different kinds of behaviors. And you usually see these options, or maybe just some of these options. But I wanted to go over these with you because I think it's important for you, everyone who's listening, to reflect on how you respond to conflict. So, for those of you who said yes to that poll question, did someone make you feel unsafe, uncomfortable, or bad at work? What kind of response did you have in your body, wherever in your body or in your mind? Did you fight? Were you kind of aggressive? Did you fight back with them? Did you flee? Did you just go to another place in the moment? Um, did you freeze? Like, as in, usually what that means is you dissociate, you're there, but you're not present. Another response is by fawning the person. So perhaps if the person is powerful in your organization, you just complimented them and tried to appease them as much as possible. Or did you fester? Did you ruminate? And did you just feel more and more angry about the situation? without actually saying or doing anything. So take a moment now and just think about what your response usually is, because we all tend to have these in different conflict situations. And what I find interesting is that, and someone had pointed this out to me when I did some training, is that the legal rules around what constitutes workplace harassment really only capture some of these neurological responses, right? If someone fights in response to conflict, that will be considered, usually that might be violence, or sometimes they might get really angry and yell. Uh, that response to conflict gets categorized as workplace harassment. Um, Even though a lot of these other behaviors, like if you're talking to someone and they disagree with you, and instead they just freeze and dissociate, or they fester and they ruminate about you, or they just avoid you and like go somewhere else, that usually exacerbates the conflict. And it's not workplace harassment, but it just makes things worse and makes things very difficult in a work environment. So, you know, ideally in a workplace, people have some self-awareness to be able to kind of understand what their neurological response is to conflict in order for them to see, okay, this is what's happening in my body right now, but how can I move past that? Now, when you are hiring people and when you think about your employees and when you're evaluating their work performance, most people do not include competencies around dealing with workplace conflict. And I've advised employers to try to do this, but again, we focus so much on skills that are either easily quantifiable or skills that are so directly related to the tasks of their job. But really, we tend to look at other qualities like, leadership or things like that in a more vague way. And I think that conflict competencies should be included, particularly for managers or people managers in any work environment. And these are some questions that you can ask both yourself and that you can pose to potential applicants to make sure that they are competent at dealing with workplace conflict. So, asking them to think of a conflict situation and asking them how they manage their emotions and reactions despite the discomfort. We know that in a work environment, more often than not, people are going to feel unsafe or uncomfortable, right? So, how do you respond to conflict? What are the feelings you have inside you? Is it one of those five? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn, fester? And how do you manage it when you feel that way? And the second question here, I find this particularly meaningful because I have a lot of friends that work kind of in the act or not work, but participate in, as activists in the activism world. And being an activist often involves really strongly advocating for a position. Less often, they're listening to someone else's perspective that is different from theirs and trying to genuinely understand it. So, thinking about yourself or perhaps a people manager, it's good to ask, what's your experience with listening to and understanding someone with a different viewpoint? We all talk about active listening as being an important quality, but when you think about people in your life who disagree with you, who have very different views from you, when was the last time you actually interacted with someone who had such differing views and genuinely tried to understand their perspective? I think it's something, people talk about echo chambers on social media, things like that. It's much more rare to have open disagreements and conversations like that, which is why organizations need to do more to really assess who they're hiring to make sure that they are able to hire people who can deal with these kinds of conflicts because they're so present in work environments and they have the potential to really destroy relationships in work environments as well. So just something you should think about in addition to being self-aware of how you respond to conflict. It's good to be self-aware and to really look at other workers you have and think, okay, how are you managing your emotions and how are you dealing with situations where someone who is very different from you? Now, as you're hearing this from me, you're probably thinking about training, right? This is a webinar, it's kind of like a training session. And I used to do a lot of training for organizations on dealing with workplace harassment. And I thought I was doing a good job. People were engaged, people seemed to enjoy the training sessions, they were entertained. But something I never really had to do was evaluate the effectiveness of the training. And so recently this book came out by Frank Dobbin and Alexander Kalev. Work at Harvard, and this is really a book about evaluating the effectiveness more so around training on diversity, training and training programs, but also diversity initiatives. So they critique a lot of those programs in here, but a couple of things really stood out for me as they relate to harassment training. One of the things that they looked at was what happens when harassment training is done for organizations by lawyers or in-house counsel. And basically, lawyers are probably among the worst people to do this training because participants do not like being told that what they're doing is maybe legally prohibited because it makes them feel like the whole point of the training session is just to cover the asses of the employer, right? And their liability issues. So that makes them disengaged, number one. Number two, this kind of training often tells employees what they're not supposed to do. You're bad. You can't do this. And obviously, that's not a positive experience for learners, for people who are trying to understand the meaning of harassment, just people telling them what they can't do. So after reading this, it really forced me to really reevaluate, what my training around workplace harassment is like, how it's structured. And I did change it significantly as a result of this because, well, first of all, for any of us who are working, it's good to kind of reevaluate what you're doing to make sure it's still effective. And also, I wasn't really enjoying it. I don't like telling people what to do. I'd rather inspire people to feel more comfortable talking about what it is they want from their workplace and their workplace culture. So, what that meant for me was that I ended up changing my training. And again, this is something that you can do as well within your work environment. If you're kind of a leader in your organization, this is particularly important is trying to understand your workplace values. So the way I often ask or deal with it in these training sessions is I ask people, how do people want to treat each other and how do people want to be treated by each other? Do they want like what is respect? What do they want to feel like when they come to work and how do they want to interact with people? And then secondly, how does everyone want to handle disagreements and conflict? So instead of operating from the perspective that, harassment is bad and cannot happen and is going to be prevented at all costs, we're going to acknowledge that there's going to be conflict and disagreements in a work environment. How do you want to handle them? What does it mean to have these conversations? And I think what happens most often is that people want their colleagues to not take things personally, to talk directly to the person who's made them feel bad, and to deal with it as soon as it happens as much as possible. That has happened so many times. People have said those things. Now, of course, people need to develop the resiliency to be able to kind of have those conversations or be guided by people in their organization who can support them through those conversations. But these are questions that really don't get asked in work environments very often. it's assumed that people will treat each other with respect and not harass people, but we don't actually know what that looks like. So maybe treating other people well is, if they're being criticized, maybe they don't want to have it be in public. Maybe if they're going to be criticized, there needs to be some information to show how they formulated their opinion, some justification, just because that's often, a source of conflict for people. And also, in terms of how people want to handle disagreements, it's good to understand what kind of support people will want when those disagreements occur. One of the things that I've done for a large organization is uh, help people kind of, after an investigation is concluded, work together again. And usually that involves a meeting with each party individually and then bringing them together. And it's kind of amazing to see these two people who previously were kind of very much at odds with each other, one making a complaint against the other, relating to each other and being like, being forced to ask the question, what do you want from your working relationship together? And for them to kind of express similar views about what they want. Because most people just really want to be able to work together in harmony, and they understand that that might not always be the case, but they sometimes just need to have a direct conversation about how they're going to do it and what's going to happen if there is a problem. So they don't have to deal with either an investigation or sitting with a lot of negative feelings for a long time. But you do need to have the conversation with people. And a lot of the times for me, when I have those facilitated conversations, it ends with a written agreement. It's not very long, but there is something powerful about putting down in words what people want to do with each other. And speaking of words, we're going to get to that in a second when we move on. So, conflict baselines are essentially the principles that we want to follow when we're dealing with workplace conflict. And at the end of what I tend to call a conflict orientation session, which is something I lead as a form of, or as an alternative to, traditional training, we kind of go through these questions about how people want to treat each other. We also talk about the barriers for people treating each other well, and then move on to how people want to have disagreements. Um, we come up with a set of principles, and those principles are just like be you know really sort of talk to people with respect. When there's a problem, address it with them directly. These kinds of very basic rules. Um, we put that down in writing for everybody to have so they can always point to it. Now, the other part of this that I don't often get to participate in is revisiting the conflict baselines. So usually when there's any kind of training session, it happens, like, especially for respectful workplace training, it happens once a year. Maybe there's a refresher session for managers, but what I believe needs to happen, based on my experience and based on what I've read, is that workplace conflict needs to be addressed regularly and openly. That means that in every team meeting, there needs to be an opportunity for people to bring forward conflicts that they're having with people. Now, it may not be the appropriate venue, right? You might not want everybody present to deal with it, but if it's not dealt with openly, then it's going to be a problem. So sometimes what I would advise managers to do is to openly ask if there are any conflicts or problems that people want to address in the moment as a group. And if not, as a group in the moment, invite everyone who's present to speak to the manager afterwards about any conflicts that are going on, so the manager can then work with both parties to bring them together, to remind them of the conflict baselines, and to facilitate a conversation to help both parties get through the problem. Now, I am certain that for those of you who are listening, this is probably not a practice that you have in place. Most people are not openly discussing conflict at regular meetings or in one-on-one meetings with employees. I mean, a lot of organizations also just lack a structure for regular team meetings or regular one-on-one meetings. But even if you're doing it casually, even if you're doing kind of walk around management where you're visiting people, these things need to be addressed head on. And that's why your managers need to have really good conflict, workplace conflict competencies so they can address these with confidence. Um, so I hope that's something that resonates with you, even though it might be something that's very difficult to implement because, first of all, it takes a lot of time and you're dealing with usually a workplace culture where people are extremely avoidant. And it's hard to push people into a more open conflict discussion in the same way that it's hard to push people to be kind of more self-aware and more curious and more, engage in more active listening. A lot of the books that exist on dealing with workplace conflict would require every employee to go through a really intense round of training that would happen on a monthly basis where and I won't get into all the details of all of the types of things that employees should be learning to do in order to deal with conflict that these books advise. Um, but I do think as a first step, it's really good for employees to kind of be self-aware about how they deal with conflict and follow as a group the baselines that they set for themselves in terms of how they want to deal with it. Because dealing with workplace conflict really is just a matter of being able to be self-reflective, being able to hold on to the conflict and really try to understand it, which usually involves listening and trying to understand the other person's perspective and giving yourself the time to think, okay, how do I want to address this problem in a way that, doesn't negate my own interests, but doesn't also exacerbate the conflict that exists. One thing that I've done that is can be helpful that exists in different work environments is offering, you know, you often just need to give one-on-one coaching to people when they are dealing with conflicts. And hopefully you have managers who are doing that in the moment, and the managers are offering coaching that aligns with the conflict baselines. So a lot of managers, again, who are conflict avoidant will not be really suggesting a conversation directly with the other person or looking into how is this conflict affecting you and how can you overcome that. So one of the things that I've done for organizations to just add another layer of support is by giving employees access to me as an external conflict advisor who kind of provides the support that's necessary to deal with the conflict that's occurring in the work environment. That's what this thing canary relates to. And in my experience doing that, I've noticed it's pretty amazing. Employees don't really need that much help. It's like they need to just know that someone is there that they can talk to. Number one, that does a huge service for them. The other thing is that they don't need that much advice. They just need to be kind of reminded that this is a conflict, they can manage it. They just maybe need to kind of figure out how they're reacting to it, why the conflict exists, and kind of figure out a strategy that works for them for addressing it with the person. And again, it doesn't actually take that long, but you do need to talk about it directly. And a lot of the times people are not talking about it directly, or when they do, they're just reporting it up to a manager, or they are, complaining about it to a colleague who's just validating their experience without challenging them to try to address the problem and talk to the person involved in the conflict. So that is my presentation, and I know that it's sort of a broad range of ideas, but I think it's really important to again figure out, okay, how are we talking about conflict in our work environments, and how can we make it a regular part of our conversation, and how can we ensure that our people leaders especially have these conflict competencies?
Thank you so much. Well, this is such an interesting framing of uh, conflict and workplace conflict. I think we're often thinking about the rules and the steps, and I think both very empowering, but also a little bit daunting to know that we can actually solve the issues ourselves, or at least approach them
Hmm.
in a way that's more direct than maybe we're used to approaching them. And I think this has actually very broad applications in life as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, so I know there's one question about, and I think you spoke mostly from the perspective of an employee who is sitting in a like
Yeah.
in that situation. So there was a question about how this might apply outside a firm, and maybe also if you could talk a little bit about the power imbalance too, because we didn't talk about the fact like when you're an employer or where you're a manager and you have power over a team, there is, I think, a different dynamic. Or if you're the architect and your client is the one who is bringing you the conflict, you want to keep the client, you want to keep the client happy. Like, can you offer some of how some of your ideas and themes could apply in those other situations?
Yeah, so I think when you're dealing with a client and there's a power imbalance there, first of all, again, going back to the kind of response that you give, like if we talk about those different kinds of trauma responses, right? I think for those of you who have experiences with difficult clients, try to figure out which of these how you react to those conflict situations. Think about that reaction and then and this is again more based on my reading about this, try to imagine yourself being more of an effective advocate for your interests and coming from a position where you're maybe feeling more brave. And one of the exercises that's recommended is like setting up a series of chairs and like so sitting in one chair and then naming a chair as the chair for the sort of more effective advocate version of you, sitting in that chair and trying to imagine a conversation with that client from that perspective. But I do think that also, and this is for me as well, this is more based on my experience when I've dealt with conflict from someone else in a position of power, I try to take my time to understand why they might be reacting that way, um, which might require further questions, but also, with various pieces of information you can probably figure out and cobble together and think, okay, what is it that's motivating them to respond in this way? And so then, okay, if I think about that, how can I appease those interests while still advocating for my interests at the same time? It's very difficult when there's a power imbalance, no question. But I think the best way to respond is to feel more in control of yourself. And because that's the only thing you can do. The power imbalance can't go away. And in the context of employee manager, yes, addressing conflicts head on with a manager can be difficult uh, because they have power over you. And that's just sort of one of the facets of a workplace that you can't really avoid. So the only way that I would advise someone to deal with that is by speaking to obviously another person who's maybe in a similar power or like similar rung that is not your direct manager to try to talk through some of those concerns with them because maybe they know the person and try to figure out what the best way would be to address that conflict head on if you can. But
Mhm.
again, that's asking a lot, and I wouldn't want people to be addressing power, like, conflicts with people where you know how they'll react and they'll react in a way that kind of diminishes your position or something like that. And that's
Mhm.
unfortunately just like part of the work environment that a lot of people are in, and you have to figure out how long you can stay there.
Right, right. But it's such a, I think this slide in particular is really helpful because conflict rarely is going to be helped when you're in one of these states.
Exactly.
So, a trick or a tool might be that you just need to figure out how to regulate your nervous system.
Which is just breathing usually, just
Yeah.
breathing. That's the
Or
main thing you're supposed to do.
really, because I go out and have a walk or like a sweet treat or
Yeah,
something
exactly.
and come back. But yeah, usually like a walk or some kind of stepping away from the situation. Rarely are you going to solve the problem when the nervous systems are elevated. But yeah, and there's a question there that came in as you were talking
Oh yeah.
um, that like if you've got this different conflict style, so your manager, and you see this also in relationships too, when there's a conflict avoidant person,
Yeah.
and then there's maybe the more anxious or the more fighting person. Are there specific WIT tools, or is there something that you'd suggest if someone really doesn't want to engage in the conflict? Like, how could you approach that if you know their conflict style is to maybe freeze or flight, I guess, run away from the issue itself? Like, how would you, can you give us maybe even a specific example of where you've seen how that can be an effective, like what could be an effective way forward?
Yeah, I think if someone has one of these responses, like unless the organization does something such as, compelling them to go through training to be aware of that response,
Hmm.
you're not going to get very far.
Yeah.
And so you have to be resigned to the fact that they are not going to change, probably. That's why these conversations have to be kind of as a group, as opposed, I'm sure a lot of people in this session are very aware of conflict issues and aware of how they respond. But I don't, it's like I don't have a recommendation because I think it's really important to recognize when people are just who they are and they don't want to change,
Mm.
and you can't change them.
Hmm.
And I don't want to sort of put people into positions where they're trying to approach the issue and then the person does react exactly in the way you'd expect them to.
Right.
It's a bit demoralizing, but I think you have to figure out, okay, if addressing it head on is not going to help, then I have to not address it. I think one of the best alternatives, and this is something that comes up often with employees who are fighting with each other, is sometimes just having another person present changes how someone reacts.
Hmm.
So maybe if there's a third person present,
Hmm.
both people calm down a little bit, or
Mm.
the person who's present is of a certain level of authority, such that that person can be told, like, you need to calm down or you need to
Right.
change your behavior. So that happens a lot, and it's good if it's someone both of you trust to be
Right.
who's very good with all these kind of conflict competencies. That's what I would recommend, if anything.
Mm. Yeah. One thing I do remember, well, I think it's interesting you framed those questions for if you're interviewing someone, so you want a specific skill set, because it brought to mind one of the questions I was asked in a job that I had was around if your manager goes on a course of action that's different than what you recommend, how do you deal with it?
Right.
So I think that's an interesting skill. Sometimes it's not like sometimes we think about resolving the conflict as getting what you want, but maybe another way to look at it is just being okay with, all right, well, that's not the path I would have chosen, or it's not the path I recommended them. But
Hmm.
maybe there are, I think sometimes approaching things with curiosity, like, why do you want this to be so? So maybe if you're an architect and your client really wants this, provided they're, following the building code and meeting all the life safety requirements, the design choice might be, in your view, disastrous, horrible, ugly, but the client might have a very different set of priorities. So I think getting to that place of curiosity, but I don't think you could be in that place of curiosity if you're in
If
a
you're in this state.
fight, flight, freeze. You're just like, I need to be right.
Yeah, when you're in one of these states, you are focused on yourself only. So then
Right.
you hear what someone wants, it's different from what you want, you take it very personally,
Right.
right? So when
Right.
we tell people don't take things personally, it's like telling someone, like, don't be traumatized. Don't be
Yeah.
don't be
Yeah.
in one of these states, I find, because you do
Yeah.
need to be able to get out of that to think objectively. You think, what does
Yeah.
this person want outside
Yeah.
of me? Why have they chosen this course of action? It's not about me, it's about something with them. Let's learn why.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, it might go poorly. Like if I've been in the position where I've asked managers and they don't want to answer, they become very defensive, which
Yeah.
again is, you have to be mindful of that. But sometimes that can be the beginning of a different conversation. Or I've learned, oh my goodness, I was operating under this assumption in this sphere, but I didn't realize there are all these other factors at play,
Yeah.
things that I hadn't considered in my own analysis of the situation. So that's something to keep in mind. Somebody is asking, one of the attendees wanted to know or ask you if you could give some examples of conflict baselines.
Yeah, so some of them are like the ones I mentioned a couple of them in the session. One is like if you have a problem with someone, address it like immediately, like try to talk to the person immediately, try to talk directly to the person as much as possible when you have a problem with them, as opposed to talking to other people. Like that should be the first approach. And the other, as I said, I think the third one that is really important, as we just mentioned, is don't try not to take things personally. So when you have a
Mm,
disagreement with someone, it's not about you as a person. Try to
mm-hmm,
focus on the fact that it's something about the work. And
mm,
again, these are things that you do need to have like on hand or
mm-hmm,
be able to remind people of and have everyone agree to,
mm-hmm.
because then it just is something you can always turn to when a disagreement arises, because everyone has these sessions, these training sessions, they come up with these baselines or they learn about how to deal with the conflict and then they just forget about it. So you need
Right.
to have it readily available. Those are some of the
Yeah.
baselines I would suggest, or that
Yeah.
not that I would suggest, that have come up repeatedly in the sessions I've done
Okay, good. Yeah, yeah. What do you, in your experience, why do you think people take things personally?
personally.
Yeah, and
Because we all take things personally. We're all just very self-centered people. So like this is the culture of self-obsession, the culture of self. Or what was it, Christopher Latch, The Culture of Narcissism? That book came out in the 70s and like there was reissued, I think about a decade ago. And
Uh-huh.
our therapeutic culture is all focused that we're fixated on, that, all of the
Mm-hmm.
words we use, like trauma and things like that, we're all kind of referring to the self and what the self
Mm.
needs. And so that's why we take things personally.
Right. We need, well, I love your example of like people will always validate what we say. We want to be
Yes.
that friend who's like, "Oh yeah, you were right.
Yeah.
That's horrible." But how do we go about seeking out the person, or maybe it's like your chatbot
Yes.
who's
Yeah.
going to be on like brutally honest, and we don't
Well,
want that. Like that
well,
seems to be a
chatbots don't really do that. I was talking to a friend who's a psychiatrist who says that one of the problems with chatbots is that, or like, like ChatGPT, is that
yeah.
if you have a kind of obsession about something,
Mm,
you will keep asking questions of ChatGPT and they'll keep responding to you. They won't stop, right?
yeah,
Even if the right thing to do would be to actually just not entertain those questions anymore.
right.
But so you'd have to really prompt you'd have
Yeah,
to
give me
prompt the ChatGPT to like, please challenge me on my views. Here's my view, right?
Yeah, yeah. And maybe we need to do that with our friends. Just say, give me the,
Yes,
or colleagues.
and you probably have friends or colleagues who are good at that. Like
Yes.
even in my circle, like I know I have a friend that calls me when they know they need to be challenged, and then other people when they need to be validated. It's just sort of who you
Yeah.
call.
Yeah. But knowing that there's value in both maybe
Yes,
is something that we need to develop in a
yes,
workplace
definitely.
and not just that kind of, are we getting like a dopamine hit when we're validated? I don't know what the
For sure.
neurological thing is,
Or not,
but
yeah, or just not being challenged, because that is
mm,
difficult. It's just a difficult headspace for us to be in, where we're looking at
mhm,
things objectively and thinking like we're all, it's like confirmation bias. Like we're always
mhm,
looking for things to confirm the feeling that we have, as
mhm,
opposed to looking for someone who might challenge it.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I have a question. Okay, I think Ashley's going to hop in with a
Okay.
question and let her come on camera.
Hi, Will. Thanks again for
Hey,
your presentation.
no problem.
So earlier you mentioned when you were explaining a couple things about getting people back to a working relationship where you had them in a room
Yeah.
and you made them actually sign like a document. Can you actually provide an example? Don't have to name names or anything, but
Yeah.
how did you get those people to be in the room in the first place? Because clearly they probably didn't even want to be in the same room. And then have them come together to actually sign a written whatever it was, and then agree to those baselines and then actually move forward from that in a way that it wasn't a conflict once they left the room. Like everybody was fine, temperatures were down. Can you
Yeah.
kind of provide an example where you actually had to do that and what was that like?
I'm trying to think of what one that happened recently where people were like, often what happens is, so I've done a lot of work like this for a long-term care agency, or not just long-term care, they work in various homes for people with disabilities and things like that. Sometimes people have a bad day at work, right? And they behave erratically. It happens. They yell, they're really upset with someone, or there's a misunderstanding about something that's happened. And then because they behaved erratically, a complaint is made, right? And the complaint is investigated, blah, 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 blah. It takes a long time. At the end of the investigation, the employer is the one that says, all right, now we're doing this mediation. So the employer is telling them it's not a required process. Like I tell people it's voluntary, but the employer is like, we think you need to do this. And that goes a long way, right? The employer is saying like or they're saying you're going to have to work together at some point. So we've found that this is a way to make you feel more comfortable working together. If you think about workplace harassment complaints, if there's a finding that someone made an inappropriate comment or maybe gave some criticism in a way that wasn't professional, they're probably not going to be fired, right? So you know that you're going to have to work with the person. Already that's going to be awkward. So what would be less awkward would be figuring out having that first conversation with the person be direct and be supported by people. So the way I usually do it is that in that initial meeting I have with each party, we kind of go through all the feelings they're having, but I also tell them we're not going to talk about the past. We're not going to relitigate or go over what someone did or didn't do. I'm just going to ask you what you want out of your working relationship moving forward. And maybe it's not much. Maybe they're like, don't want to be friends, just want to be professional, but keep our distance. Like we want to just say hi, bye, that's it. And that's usually fine. And then the other person is probably like totally okay and with that approach. And so when we come to have our meeting together, each person gives a very brief opening statement and we kind of just talk about what they want out of their working relationship. Here are the things we want. We write it down and it's very simple. And they have to, what I usually try to include is a requirement that they like, and this might sound strange, but they have to have like a non-work related conversation on a regular basis. They have to be like, how are things going? Like just treat them as people and remember that they are just people. They're not out to get you. And that actually does go a long way. I know that's not giving you a lot of like maybe I don't know if that's specific enough, but again, I have to remember the specific. I haven't done one in a month that related to like I've got someone going, but that long-term care one, I've just done a number for them, and it's always a single inappropriate comment or an accusation that someone did something wrong. That's usually what it all stems from.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I have another question because you mentioned at the very beginning, well, about the one exception to a workplace that's good at conflict resolution is the firefighters,
Yeah,
which I love because you're right. You're going into these very dangerous situations. You're living and working all the time. So, do you think there are any lessons that a non-firefighting workplace can take? I know you see things when they go awry, so you're
yeah.
probably not seeing the stellar workplaces where they're putting everything into place. But just in terms of your observations in this space, do you think there are things like, do you see the value? I know we have this team building and sometimes people want to participate and they don't, but are there things that you think have more impact that maybe workplaces can do, or ways that we can foster the environment so that the conflict can be resolved in a healthy way?
Yeah, people just need to treat each other as people, which means just casually talking to people. Like, I don't know,
Mhm.
I've worked in environments where people just don't really talk to each other. And especially since the pandemic, that happens less and less because people aren't together. And so you actually don't see people as people. Like, if you can have, especially from managers to employees, like in the same way that there's been studies have shown that like in a therapist in terms of the quality of therapy, what matters most, or if a psychiatrist or a therapist with a patient or a client, what matters most is the quality of the therapeutic relationship in terms of outcomes, in terms of how effective the therapy will be. I really think the same goes for managers and employees. It's the quality of that relationship that will affect how good of a manager. It's not like specific competencies. It's really about the quality of the relationship they can forge. And usually, and again, this is from working with this municipality, I noticed this a lot. the managers who were best were just like present. That's all it was. They were present. They were talking to them as people, not just about their work, and just checking in with them, seeing how things were going, always there in some way. And if employees could do that for each other, that would also make a huge difference, I think.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. It's so a basic thing, but
So
something,
basic.
something, yeah, that I think the workplace has shifted after
Yeah,
COVID and
yeah.
having hybrid workplaces.
Hmm.
So, I know one thing we do here is just try to come in on the same day so that we have that
Yeah,
face to face. I think we all recognize there are benefits to working from home for the tasks that you
of
need, but
course.
there are huge benefits to like taking a walk with your colleague, with your friend, sitting down for lunch,
Yes,
making the coffee and like spending 15 minutes talking about whatever
exactly.
the
Exactly.
reality TV show you both love
Exactly.
to watch. That kind of thing goes a long way. And that's scientific, right? Well,
Yes,
even though we're
I
not
think
giving
so.
legal advice,
Yeah, 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 totally. Not legal
that's a,
advice. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So I'm not seeing any new questions trickling in, but everybody's staying to the end. So I think people are very engaged.
That's good.
And it's good to see the polls. And we're going to send out a survey shortly. So I don't know if you had any closing thoughts or anything you think you wanted to add before we close off today, before I give my final closing announcements. Well,
I'm just trying to think. I wanted to think of a really good example, and I'm gonna just share one from more my personal life, and it will only take a couple of minutes that I think would be helpful to kind of understand the conflict situation. So, one of the things I was talking to Claire and Ashley about before this is I helped sponsor a family of refugees from Syria, and they've now been here for a couple of years. And when you're sponsoring a family, there's lots of different things that you do, but there's a family of, two parents, three kids. And as you all know, for those of you with kids, especially, summer programs, camps, that's something you really got to figure out and work towards, right? Because they need to be occupied in those 2 months that they're off. And luckily, this year for the two older kids, I was able to enroll them in like TDSV does a summer school for like a month, and in the afternoon, there's a program run at certain schools by the Blue Jays. They run this thing called Jays Care, which is like a whole program where there's sports, activities, and they do it for the half day for after summer school and then for a full day for 2 weeks in August. It's like a really impressive program.
mm,
So I luckily like it all worked out. Like, and there's so many things when you're dealing with a family of refugees, like you want things to be close to where they live. It needs to be, the times need to work so kids can be picked up. It needs to not cost a lot of money. Like there are so many barriers to those things working out. And in this case, it did work out.
mm,
Anyway, so they're in the camp. Things are great. I'm so happy that it all worked out. And then I get a call from the daughter, and she's calling me at like 11:45 in the morning, and she's like, "Oh, I'd given her a gift card. She graduated from grade 8." And she was calling me because she didn't know how the gift card worked because you had to register it online. And she was like, "How do I register this gift card?" And I was like, "Well, before we do that, like, where are you calling me from? It's 11:45. Are you not in summer school?" And she was like, "Oh no, I didn't go today. I'm not going today." And I was like, "Why?" And she's like, "Oh, because I'm going shopping with my mom." And in that moment, I would say, in fight mode. I got straight into fight mode, and I was like, I'm really disappointed that you're not in school right now. And that you're not in school so you can go shopping, because I also knew that this special program after school, if you have 3 unexplained absences, you're kicked out of the program. And this is like a really great program. And I was like, and how many times have you been absent already? Already she was absent once, and this was the second time. And I didn't know, and like, I hadn't informed them. And so in that moment, I was so upset. But of course, like as I learned more information from the mom and from her, first of all, I learned that like a lot of kids seem to not go to school in the morning, right? And absences were just not that big of a deal. No one really suggested that it was. And of course, even though I forwarded this email as you know, for everyone here who deals with email, like you just don't read emails, right?
Yeah.
And so they didn't read the part of the email that said the thing about the absences, right? And I didn't show it to them. So even though in that moment I was so disappointed and so upset, I did, and I expressed it that way. I tried to control how intense my frustration was. I did have to take some time to be curious about why they might have made that choice. And there was also issues like the reason why they went shopping that day was because the father was available. Lots of things related to that as well
Mm,
that I hadn't accounted for. So, we all have to figure out things like this and take our time and try to notice when we're in one of these states. And I don't think I
mm,
noticed soon enough. And I could have stopped myself before and realized there isn't actually that big of an issue. It was all resolved. Um, but sometimes the response is so strong, especially when you
mhm.
care, that it's hard to control
That's such a good example
it.
because I could feel it too. Like when you put so much effort into
Yes,
something,
exactly.
I've been
Yes.
in similar situations and you're
Yeah,
like, but you're not. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So
Anyway.
slowing down. No, that's great. And I think we can all take a some inventory of our own times where we've had those reactions. And I
Yeah.
love that you said it's because we care, right? It's
Yeah.
usually because we care and we care about our workplaces, we care about our
Yeah.
colleagues, and all those things are true. So we'll end it on that heartwarming note. And I just have a couple of quick announcements for those of you who are still on the call. Thank you again for everybody on the call for the questions and for answering the poll questions and being very honest and transparent. We do have a webinar actually this Thursday for those of you who have not signed up. It's on leading the public realm design insights from Brightwater. Again, as I mentioned, you will have your participation recorded on this transcript, provided you were here for 80% of the time. We will also be sending you, as you know, an email with a link to submit your feedback, which we highly value, and a copy of the slides as well. So thank you, everybody on the call. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, Will, so much again for coming back and sharing your amazing insights with us. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye, everybody.